NTV.
Welcome back and many thanks for staying with us. My name is Romy Busiku. We are getting into another conversation, the Take Note discussion. The government has approved a fixed rental tax on all commercial buildings and rental houses in the Kampala metropolitan area. Well, it's part of a slew of measures that were instituted in the new physical planning structure. Well, according to the finance minister, that is Matia Kasaija, these new measures are meant to put a check on the landlords who are under declaring rental tax to the government. To discuss this and a lot more, I'm now joined by Mr. Barnabas Ndawula. He is the director of Cognitus Solutions. Thank you for joining us on Morning at NTV.
Thank you
First
for
of
having
all,
me.
yes, we'd like to first know what this new requirement to have a permit before you start building has to do with the owner or the buyer. What do they have to know about this?
Well, to start with, if you're buying property or you already own property, just know that now to build, you're going to be required to pay a certain amount of money. Otherwise, they won't allow you to build. And this is, the features are that every area has been gazetted differently. There's cities, municipalities, town councils, and villages. And the permit fees are uniform. It's per square meter. You know, in the cities, it goes up to about 2 million shillings per square meter, depending on the nature of a building, up to maybe 1.2, and then municipalities is 1.2, up to something like 800, and then it's coming down. What is very interesting here is that in the village, if you're building a grass-thatched house, it's 30,000. So, in my view, one, the idea that these permits are going, the fees for these permits should go to the central government. They're all going to a consolidated fund. This adversely affects the new municipalities and the new cities because this is income they are losing, which they would have used to help in their physical planning of the new areas. For instance, if you look at like an area like Chira Town, which was a town council, it's now a municipality, it's been using these fees to develop the roads, the drainage.
Yes.
Now, if they take this money away, it goes to the consolidated fund. We know that every time money goes to the consolidated fund, it has a problem trickling down. So the
Because every time we check, it's empty.
Absolutely. So the new cities and towns and municipalities are going to be cash-strapped in terms of urban development. And then when you look at a village, somebody putting up a grass-thatched house and they have to pay 30,000 shillings. These people earn less than that probably in 6 months.
So you're telling me the person putting up a grass-thatched house
Yes.
in this village would have to part with the same money as someone putting up a structure in Kololo?
No.
Because of the uniform fees?
Because it's in the village, it's a rural area, it's got a different fee. It's a flat fee. It's 30,000. It's called Class C in terms of permits.
Right.
So you just have to pay 30,000, but it's a grass-thatched house. And the cost of building that house is probably 100,000. And then you have to pay with 30,000. And all this goes to the consolidated fund. So when is the village, the Gombolo, or the county going to be able to improve? So as a buyer or a developer of property, you've now got to know that I'm buying land in Kololo, but for me to develop it, I have to pay 2 million shillings per square meter of area. You know, depending on, so the larger the house, the more you're going to pay. If it's a storied house, you're going to pay more. If it's a bungalow, which is what most people probably build, you know that per square meter you're between 1.2 million to maybe 1,800,000. So this is something you have to keep in mind every time you're building.
And Mr. Barnabas, let's talk about the newly approved fixed rental tax rate on commercial buildings and rental houses. Most of the buildings in Kampala metropolitan area. Well, Matia Kasaija says it's intended to check on the landlords who are under declaring rental tax to the government. But in your opinion, as the director Cognitus, help us understand, what does this mean to the owner of the building?
You know, the problem at times in Uganda is that we jump onto things too fast. I remember when we were in school, we had what it's called new technology and then appropriate technology.
So the bandwagon followed suit.
Yes, it just comes down. In Uganda, you just jump onto everything. You don't just fix a tax on rent. Because, first of all, how are you going to help the landlords improve on the environment. Most landlords have small units, rental units, which are in the urban area, undeveloped, no roads, no amenities, services. So when you tax them, you give a flat rate and you tax them uniformly, it's going to be unfair to some landlords, because I could be in Lubowa, which is relatively developed, and I'll be happy to pay a certain tax. But if I'm, say, in Kisugu, the houses are not so bad, but there are no roads, and they're not planned. So how do I benefit from this tax? So in my view, I think government should first do an in-depth research in the nature of rentals across the board. Many landlords are slumlords. They completely no amenities whatsoever. So how would I pay the same tax as a slumlord as a person who is renting apartments in Kololo? There's got to be a better way to look at it. Appropriateness should be applied, not just blanket.
Unless we know that now. We also want to know, what should one consider when buying land?
Well, when you're buying land, you've got to take this in account. First of all, there are different types of tenure. So they all have different nuances. If I'm buying titled land, I would do a search with the Ministry of Lands, find out whether the person selling is actually the one on the title.
Or someone else took it.
Yeah, it's got an encumbrance, a caveat, a mortgage, things like that. And also still on titled land, it would be good to retain the services of a surveyor, to do one allocation survey and a boundary opening, so that you know exactly that I am buying piece A, it's located in this place and it's this size. Very critical as well in today's Uganda, as a due diligence. Go to the piece of land, find out who the neighbors are, have a chat with them, the local authorities, the LCs. Ensure that if A is selling me the land, he is known there and everybody knows he's the actual owner. Now this changes because what most people do not know is that there are less than probably 1.5 title holders in Uganda, 1.5 million title holders, which means the bulk of the land transactions are on untitled land, popularly known as bibanjas. Yes. Now the due diligence here differs a little bit. It's more in depth in that you have to go to the land physically, you've got to talk to the local people, you've got to find out, to get a history of the piece of land. Otherwise you're in danger of buying something that doesn't exist at all. And also, my advice is that when you're buying that kind of land, don't pay up everything up front. Do it in installments. Even if you have the money, pay 40%, take possession, put a fence, put some building materials there. Because usually when you do that, if there's anything hidden in the woodworks, it's going to come up. And that would help you to secure your piece of land.
Help us understand, what are the risks involved and how can a potential buyer protect themselves from the same risks?
Depending on what you're buying. Is it a chibanja? Is it a titled piece of land? If you're buying a titled piece of land, the moment you've identified it, Ministry of Lands has confirmed, the registrar has confirmed that that land belongs to X, Y, and Z. Again, you may retain the services of a lawyer to do that due diligence for you. Do an agreement, a properly documented piece of paper, make sure it's properly witnessed. It always helps for the local authorities to know that you're entering this transaction. And the moment you make a payment, caveat the piece of land. If you've paid 50%, put a caveat on that, showing that you've already entered into a purchase transaction with this. That usually helps you to safeguard yourself. If it's a chibanja land, make sure the local communities know that you have made this kind of payment. Try and be as transparent as possible with regards to the transaction you're entering. That is the best way to safeguard yourself. Because that way, if the person selling to you is a fraud, it will come out. If he tries to turn around and become a turncoat, again, you'll have the community to back you. This is very important.
Speaking of land valuation, how exactly is this value arrived at?
Well, that is a bit of a technical thing for a valuer, which I am not. But I know that valuers, I think, are land economists. And they take into consideration things like location, size, proximity to certain amenities, and the going market value. Roughly, that is what they take into account. As a layman, even you can go to a piece of land and say, given that I'm in Chisasi, the brokers will tell you every decimal goes for this amount of money, and because now that is the actual value of the land, the de facto value of the land. What the value I will give you is what in law would call the de jure. That is basically what is scientifically the right amount, but there is always that other value that the community knows, that the market knows. Yeah, so it's always good to get down to that.
So what challenges are associated with these land transactions?
Myriad challenges, really. But the biggest is probably fraud in terms of ownership.
That's a big one.
Yes. Usually you find yourself buying land that is either encumbered or is sold by the wrong party or has been sold a couple of times. Those are the challenges. Now, when you do a proper due diligence, you're going to avoid these issues. That's why you have to take your time. Never be in a rush to pay for a piece of land. Brokers will tell you, budgetwala, pay up, They put you in that anxious state. Don't fall for that.
Take your time. Talk to the members of the community. Ascertain whether or not the land was not taken.
Exactly.
And then you'll be good to go.
And it's important, even before you look at the papers in Ministry of Lands, go to the ground. The community always knows. This is the best way you're going to avoid being defrauded.
But then the viewer is wondering, how best can I exercise due diligence when I'm buying land?
Well, the steps are there.
Like?
For instance, like I said, if it's titled land, you write to the Register of Lands. They will give you a such certificate showing you that your plot, this block, that belongs to so and so, and it's in the names of, it's in this location and size. And then you do a location survey. It's very important with titled land today to do a location survey, because somebody will give you a title for a wetland next to a dry piece of land, and you find yourself buying a wetland. So you do that location, and then you make sure you put a caveat on the land, and then you also make sure the community knows that you're buying the land. This is how we're going to be safeguarded. In the north and the east, there's communal land. Make sure the elders are aware that you're buying a piece of land. That is critical, because their land is held communally. It's different from Buganda, it's different from titled land. So if the elders do not know, you run a risk of buying air.
So how exactly, when buying land, how does one know that they are not being conned?
Well, there's only one way to know, or maybe a couple of ways, really. Like I said, visit the piece of land, get in touch with the community.
So that's all it takes. You just show up, visit the land.
That is not all it takes.
If the community members say there's no one on the land, you're good to go?
That's not all it takes. I do know some very smart brokers who can cause a community.
So go ahead and share the knowledge.
Yeah, they can cause a community.
Yes.
So one, you have to identify the land physically.
Yes.
Because, this is what it's got to be terra cognitus. That's where the whole company thing comes from.
Yeah.
Land that you've identified. And then you go and do a proper search. Do the documents tally with the piece of land. Then, if it's not titled, try and find the history of the ownership. Because Chibanja land usually has, this was so-and-so's land, they died, the son took over, the son sold to X. So do a little bit of in-depth investigation as to the history of the piece of land.
We've also gotten incidences where more than two people have a land title for the same land. How does this happen?
Now that is high-level fraud. Now that is in the Ministry of Lands. And it happens, true. They can create concurrent pieces of land titles and a piece of land. Now, usually, when you do a search like that, you're confident that you have the right land title. Then somebody else might come up with the same land title, which means there was fraud somewhere in acquisition of this land title. But that is why I'm saying is that when you purchase a piece of land, take possession. Possession is 90% of the law. When you buy it, even before you do the transfer, and you've made a part payment, take possession of that piece of land. That act gives you a right to the piece of land and gives a right to the other person, a right to the balance of the payment. Now, if somebody else comes up with a title, you are already on the piece of land. Then you'll have to find out, how did that person acquire the title? Where was the fraud? Was it as between the person who sold to you, or did this other party acquire a title fraudulently to come and unseat you? That's where it has to go. But once you have possession of the land, you're pretty much protected. That's very critical.
Indeed.
Because fraudsters are always going to be there. We can't do anything about that. I think it's the curse of Adam and Eve. They're always going to be there.
Mr. Barnabas Ndaula, let's also talk about refugee land. We are also getting information that refugees who are being given land, they are selling it to members of the community in the surrounding environs.
Yes.
What are the immediate risks to the buyer who is buying this refugee land?
Well, essentially, you'd imagine a refugee doesn't have a right to sell the land on which they are seated. But let's have a scenario where a refugee has been on this land for, say, 5-6 years. The land law, in a way, protects them because that section that talks about a lawful occupant includes a person who's been brought onto the land by a government or a recognized authority, like a local government, etc. So if this refugee was brought onto the land by government, then technically they are lawful occupants, which then means a lawful occupant has a right to transfer their proprietary interest in that land to the next party.
Don't you think the land seller and the land buyer might find themselves in some sort of quagmire? Because I've been talking to officials from the lands ministry and they were saying it is totally wrong because this is government land that was simply given to a refugee to make ends meet. Giving it to another person would be wrong. Don't you think the buyers at some point, if government wakes up, might be in trouble?
Absolutely, because after the amendment in 2010 of the Land Act, there is a necessity to acquire consent from the landlord. So if I am a lawful occupant or a bona fide occupant, any Chibanja owner, if I'm selling to you, I've got to get consent from the landlord. In this case, it would be government. So a refugee would essentially have to get consent from the landlord.
Yes.
But this aspect of consent from the landlord has not been properly enforced. So you find that Chibanja land, lawful, bona fide occupants, they keep on moving the land. It changes hands without the consent of the landlord. But if somebody was to take it to court and insist on the law, then obviously, if you bought that kind of land, you'd be in danger.
And that is the pertinent question that is wrapping up this conversation. When should you use legal representation during the process of acquiring land? That's our last.
If you can afford it from the very beginning, the moment you identify a piece of land you want to buy, get the services of a lawyer because they would know where all the tricks and nooks and crannies are and tie all the nuts and bolts for you. If you can afford it, please do that.
Okay, final words to our viewers who are watching. Recommendations from Mr. Barnabas Ndaula.
When it comes to purchasing of land, due diligence, due diligence, due diligence. I cannot overemphasize it. And in Uganda, it goes to just more than the documents. The due diligence must be done physically as well. Otherwise, you stand to lose. Yes.
All right, Barnabas Ndaula, he is the director, Cognitus, and we've been having this conversation largely centered around due diligence in land matters. Before you purchase that land, go to that community. Ensure that you talk to the members of the community and the surrounding environs to ascertain whether or not that land was taken. And the refugees were on government land, Bidi Bidi settlement, Changwali settlement. Do not sell that land because sooner or later the lands ministry shall come for you, the buyer and the seller in that regard. My name is Romy Busiku. It's Morning at NTV. Let's take a short break. We'll be right back with more information. Keep it here.